Well, so far we've learned to put 2 blocks together, and then we just keep adding blocks until we make rows. And in this case, we're going to work with rows of 5. So for instance, here I've put together my first row of 5 squares. And you can see maybe the habit that I am tracking is about eating my vegetables. And I was really good at first, eating them the first 3 days, and then I missed a day, but then I was back on track. So I've got 5 squares all sewn together here. And then my next set of data, my next row, I kept eating my vegetables, but then I had another off day. It happens, but then I was back on track, but maybe then it was the weekend and I splurged a little bit. But what I need to do now is to put these rows together. One of the most important things here when we're putting our rows together is to make sure that we have all of our data in the right order so that it's representing us correctly. And in this case, I've double checked and I've made sure, and I definitely remember that I'm always better at the beginning when I'm starting off trying to build a new habit. So I have my first row here and my second row here. To make sure I'm keeping them in the same order, I like to put them straight out in front of me, and I'm gonna flip my top row, row 1, onto row 2. And what I'm really interested in is keeping all of these squares lined up with each other. I'm really gonna try to match where all of my squares line up. So I'm gonna flip this one on top. And you can see in this case, I have pressed my seams open, makes it a little bit easier. But if you've pressed your seams onto the dark side, this will work just as well. It'll work just fine. But I really like to use pins here to help me remember which side I'm going to sew on, but also to help me keep everything lined up. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pin, and right where this seam meets, maybe about 1/4 of an inch down from the top, I'm just going to push my pin right through there. You can see it going through right at that seam. And then on this row that's facing up, remember we're always going to put our pretty sides together, I'm going to take my pin, and also about 1/4 of an inch of the way down from the top, I'm going to push it in right at that seam. And I'm just going to let my pin hang out there, flop around for a minute while I put my other pins in. I like to put all my pins in first, and then I'll secure them. So I'm going to do the same thing, the next seam about 1/4 of an inch down, right where the seam meets, and then in my second row, same thing, putting my pin right at that seam and then kind of letting it flop about. And I kind of like to take it, I'll push them all the way through so that they're a little bit secure and I can make sure that everything's nice and lined up. Go ahead and use pins for the rest of my row. All right, got my pins hanging out. Now I don't want to just leave my pins flopping around like that. They're going to get in my way, they're going to poke me, so now I'm going to secure my pins. So now I'm just going to take them and push them through so they're not flopping around anymore. And you don't need to put your pin in at the seam. It doesn't matter where the pin comes out at the bottom. It's just to secure it so it's not flopping about. So I'm going to go ahead and secure all of those pins down. And then sometimes, depending on how large my piece is at the end here, I like to make sure that these corners are also matched up, and so I'll put a pin in there. Make sure they're lined up exactly right, put one in there, and the same with this corner over here, just to make sure everything's lined up the way I want it to be. All right, now I have my 2 rows pinned together. They're all in the correct order, and I'm going to go ahead and sew right along here. I can sew by hand, or I can sew, in this case, I'm going to sew by machine, taking that 1/4 of an inch seam, 1/4 of an inch from this edge right here. So I'm going to go ahead and sew that, taking the pins out as I'm sewing. All right, I've gone ahead and sewn all the way down, taking my pins out. and you can see I've got my seam going right along here. Just go over these other seams when I get to them. And then I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And as usual, I can press it open, or in this case, I'm just going to press it up toward the top like this. Run my fingernail along here a little bit. If you have an iron, you can certainly use it. Give that a good flattening out so it lays nice and flat. And there we go. I have now sewn 2 rows together. So all I do for the rest of my block is continue adding rows. So the next row, I'm going to make sure it's in the correct order, add it on to row 2. I'm going to add row 4 to row 3, and so on and so forth until I've finished my entire block.